Hi, and welcome to the Sierra Bible Church Sermon of the Week. We hope you enjoy this message by Pastor Nathan Levering.
Well, last week, as we sort of dove into the very beginning of the story in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, we tried to say kind of as loudly as we could that the human story, and it's good to remind ourselves, doesn't start in Genesis 3. Now, if you don't know the Bible kind of as it works through those chapters, Genesis 3 is when the thing falls apart. Our story, the human story, the God and his people story, actually starts in chapter 1, and that's important. It starts in a place where God, in intimacy with his creation, his people, walk, if you will, in the cool of the morning together, where he gives them an opportunity to play a part with that which they've been given. Last week we talked about this idea that we're co-authors. We've been invited by the author of the story to play our part, to make culture. What we talked a bit about last time we gathered was that what this looks like is to take the kind of raw materials of earth, the stuff that we're surrounded with, the people, and in our time, in our season, to rearrange those things in such a way that God gets glory and humans flourish. That's what we're set up to do in Genesis 1 and 2. But in Genesis chapter 3, as we looked at a bit, it starts with a serpent entering the story. And we get a bit of a backstory on God's great story from some other place. Like, where in the world did the serpent come from? How did he enter the story? And what we see is that he was actually a created angel who, given the task to lead the sort of, group of angels in worship, decided, I think I got this. And in fact, he would rather be worshiped than direct others to worship. And he rebels and he pushes back against God's design for him. And God throws him out of heaven, and he shows up then coming against the one thing that God cares most about, you and I. And what the serpent does when he shows up is he begins to twist the words of the author. He begins to say, I'm going to author my own story. And he steps in with some version of authority and twists what God says. And in that, he breaks down the one thing that sort of all life is sort of built on, and that's the trust between God's creation and who he is and what he's inviting us into. And when that falls apart, we rebel. And as we know, we looked at last week, the Adam and Eve story, and they fall, and sin enters the world. Death enters the world. And if we leave chapter 3, which we did last week, and we continue to kind of walk through the story, what we see is this sort of downward spiral, I know it's very inspirational, of human history. Death becomes death, which becomes rebellion and oppression, and things continue to get worse to a point where God says then these words. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth. We see this grieving of God, this sense of, it was seemingly just moments before when we walked in the intimacy of the garden together. And now we have a picture of God saying, this thing is such a wreck that it's actually wrecking itself. And into that story, we find ourselves experiencing God's redemption. What we'll see, though, in this sort of big story, we see our stories written in. As I was thinking about this kind of downward spiral, and I was thinking about this sense of hopelessness, like all of us have been there, sometimes in our very real lives. I thought of one kind of, simple way. That, there was a time Kathy and I were coming back from vacation, and we're actually, with the Myers, and we're heading back from an amazing week on Lake Powell. We're in our box van pulling our water ski boat up a hill into the wind, And we're at that moment where the amount of miles we have to go to the next gas station is starting to outpace the amount of miles our van tells us we're going to be able to drive on the tank of gas we have. You been there? And I'm like, Kathy's looking at me like, are we going to make it? Oh, sure, we're going to make it. 75 miles we can still drive. It's only 35 miles to the next gas station till the wind starts blowing, till the hill starts coming up. And pretty soon we're like 2020. And I'm like, this does not look good. And she's still looking at it like you wives do, and judging my amount of gas I put in. Running out of gas is always bad, but on vacation, like, come on, you should never run out of gas on vacation. Because kind of you can always stop and just get some more gas. But that's not how I do this. We're going as far as we can. And I'm at that point where the numbers cross. And this is sort of where we are in the human race. It's here where it's gotten so low that unless something is breathed in, the thing has come off the tracks. It's unwinding. The last sort of flicker of hope is about to be kind of blown out and extinguished. And so we then pick up the story in Genesis chapter 11. If you have a Bible, I'd encourage you to grab it, open it up to Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11 is a couple of different stories, but it picks up the story of a family by the name of Shem. And Shem is a guy that sort of led this last living hope of kind of families that knew who God was and knew what God was up to. And so charged in some ways to pass that on to the other nations in the world. So let's go ahead and pick up this story in verse 30 of chapter 11. Some of us know the story, especially chapter 12, and we'll look at that a bit this morning. But we start with these words in verse 30. Now Sarah was barren, just being introduced to this lady. She had then no children. Terah, who's actually Abraham's father, as we'll see, Terah in verse 31 took his son Abram. He becomes Abraham, of course. His grandson Lot, who was the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah, the wife of his son Abraham. Together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. This is where God's taking them. But when they came to Haran, they did what? They settled there. Like, we made it this far. And so they settle in. And as the story then continues, we see here at the end that Terah lived 205 years, and he actually ended up dying in Haran. If we hear the words of Walter Brueggemann, who wrote an amazing commentary on the book of Genesis, he said these words that might help us understand what the author is inviting us into. He says, the barrenness of Sarah is the metaphor of utter and complete hopelessness. The flicker of light has all but gone out. And yet into this place, God steps in. If you have your Bible open, look with me. We're going to look all the way into the book of Joshua. So flip over to Joshua chapter 24. I'm going to do it fast because mine's book noted. Boom. But if you need a second, it's Joshua 24. And we are going to read then together, starting with verse 2. Now, what you need to know about Joshua 24, if you don't already, is this is Joshua's sort of end of life. I'm passing the baton on to those who will come before. This is like you as a dad on your deathbed saying to your children, here's what's important. Here's how to live out your bookends. Here's from my experience what I've learned. I as a dad am passing this on to you. Don't miss it. This will help guide you between those bookends as you live out your story with integrity to the author that's writing the bigger story. And so we pick up then Joshua in this moment as he speaks to the people he's leading. Verse 2 says this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your forefathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the river and they worshiped other gods. This is chapter 11 of Genesis. Verse 3, but I, God says, but I intervened, but I stepped in. But I took your father Abraham from the land where they had settled, from the place where they thought, this is fine, from the place where they had gotten comfortable. and I led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants. And what he's saying to his audience, he wants us to hear that the same God that stepped into Abraham's story of hopelessness with redemption is the same God that knows exactly where we are. He's the same God. This is what he does. He steps in to places of hopelessness and brings hope. And then, just because we're in 24, we've got to read verses 14 on down, because this is one of those incredible challenges, right? And some of us even have these words kind of put to memory. As he says, hey, here's what it looks like to trust this God as we live out our stories. Verse 14. Now, these are those last words of Joshua. Now fear the Lord and serve him with faithfulness. Throw away the gods of your forefathers' worship beyond the river and in Egypt and serve the Lord. But he says, if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, let's just be honest for a moment. Some of us were like, yeah, I could serve the Lord, but I think I got this. Yeah, I know I could answer the call of God, but I think in most areas, I'm going with me. And so, Joshua leans in. He says, 2 paths, pick yours. If serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourself this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods your forefathers served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. Joshua then closes with these words, but as for me and my household, we decided, if we discern the will of God, we're chasing it with everything we have. As for us, we're going to serve. We're going to trust that the God that stepped into Abraham's hopelessness is the same God that will step into ours. And we're going to follow with everything we have. This is that moment, right, where we think, yeah, I've been in that marriage. Where it just felt like, unless something else it just feels like we've watched our kids kind of walk away. And we've thought, oh God, I wish I could just get them by the neck when I could when they were 2 and just drag them home. But I have to trust you and your story. This is the moment. One of our staff guys was giving a bit of his testimony this week with our staff. And you would never know it by knowing him now, but he brought us back to this time in his life. And he said, yeah, it was this season where I was paying my mortgage with my credit card. It's that moment when we say, God, I don't know that there's a way out of this. And I don't know about you, but most of us reach for the steering wheel in those times. And Joshua is saying, just remember who you serve. Remember who you can trust. Remember who was there for Abraham. Remember who is there for you. And so God's redemption comes when the call of God enters our story, as it did Abraham, as it did the nation of Israel, as it does ours. Okay, you are at Sierra Bible Church this morning. Maybe some of you didn't know that. This is our place. This is where we've been. We're a little over 50 years old, which is pretty awesome. We celebrated that this summer. As a part of being at Sierra Bible Church, you are kind of a part of a long and not ancient tradition of knowing the entire first phase of God's redemptive story through the nation of Israel on the palm or the fingers of your hand. Okay, so if you went to church here years ago, you would know that the lead pastor at that time was also my dad, and he would walk us through with some regularity a bit of the framework to help us understand, okay, what is the story? Okay, what has God done within this time of human history, and how does it all fit together? As we hit on a couple weeks ago, knowing the framework, knowing the bookends helps us find our place in the story today. So pull out your hand. You need a 5-fingered hand, which also always led to a joke about Mary Freer's 4-fingered hand. So if you brought a 5-fingered hand, pull it out this morning, and you're going to use this to get some framework. There's a test coming for how is it that God works in the nation of Israel, starting with the call of Abraham up to the person of Jesus. So if you're in one of our Story of God life groups, you're doing bits and pieces of this, even in these weeks together, as we try and piece together, at least in the framework of our thinking, what is it that God's doing in human history? This can be helpful. So you have your hand out. Your little pinky then is the person of Jesus. So pull your hand out. Mr. Warnick, yeah, I see you. So pinky is who? Jesus. So on the other side of your hand, way over here at your thumb, is the person of, we've been talking about him all morning, Abraham. Abraham existed about as far on the other side of history or the other side of Jesus as you exist this side of Jesus. So we're about 2,000 years from Jesus. Abraham's about 2,000 years from Jesus on the other side of history. So this is how this works. Between each of these fingers is about 500 years, give or take. And if you're, going, oh, fact check that guy, because that's not exactly what it says in the book. Everybody leans one way or the other on a few of these figures, but we can get close. So Abraham's over here on our thumb, about 2,000 years from Jesus. 500 years after Abraham shows up, God sends a deliverer by the name of Moses, okay? So your pointer finger is Moses. Now, he's a deliverer. Why? Because he steps in to the nation of Israel being in Egypt under the Pharaoh. He delivers their people. So these 400 years is about the time frame that the nation of Israel spent in slavery. So let's go review. Abraham, 400 years of what? Spoiler alert. Abraham's going to have a son. His name's Isaac. Isaac's going to have another son. His name's Jacob. Jacob's going to have a whole bunch of sons and one daughter. Anyone know what her name was? Dinah, yes. Oh, Kirsten was after it in her head. She just couldn't pull it out. So that's how that works, right? And you remember Joseph. He's the one with the multicolored coat. He's the one that ends up sort of being a part of that deliverance in the Pharaoh's household. He's that son that eventually gets them protected in slavery. Out of slavery, God sends a deliverer by the name of Moses, right? Moses hands the baton off to, we just read his sort of death, Joshua, right? Joshua then leads the people into the promised land. And this next 400 years is a season in our scriptures, in the biblical story, of what we call the Judges. So this is a time when they're in the promised land, they're figuring this thing out, they're building stuff, worship is oriented, the word of God is, and at the same time, it's kind of all kinds of chaos, but about 400 years of that. They then look at all the other kingdoms, right, that they're in the middle of, and they say to God, the one true king, we would really like a what? A king. God, if you'd send us a king, that just make us cool, like everybody else is cool, And so God's like, you don't really want me to send you a king because I am the king. And if you king another human, it's going to go sideways. That's just how this thing works. I'm the king. Yeah, but we'd really like one. So God's like, okay, you can have Saul. You know how that story goes. Saul eventually anoints another king, and he becomes sort of the king. He's the middle finger king, and his name is David, right? He's the one we read about in Acts when we hear what David did. We're talking about stories. What David did is he served his generation, and then he died. And I just love that. There's a part of that's like, okay, God, that's the target. What would it look like to serve my generation? And then to die. So we get David here. So Abraham, slavery, Moses, Judges, David the king. God was right, shocker. The nation then divides here. So we have the sort of two nations warring against each other. And so we have about 400 years of the divided kingdom. And then what we studied this last fall becomes this finger, Ezra and Nehemiah. Because this is just a mess, right? You've got the Persians and the Babylonians, and you have God constantly sending his people to time out, and it's a mess. And then he says, I'm going to pull you back to Jerusalem, and we're going to build a wall, and we're going to reinstitute worship, and we're going to get ready. Because God's not done. And the climax of the story is right around the corner. So they all lean in. And then for 400 years, they have to wait. It's called silence. Does it sound like your story? Yeah. So then Jesus shows up, right? He's the climax of this. So let's pick up the story then back in chapter 12. When the call of God, God's great act of redemption, comes to Abram. Now, you might know him as Father Abraham. he starts as Abram. Abram, it's not to mess us up with the language. Abram actually means father or dad. Abraham means like father of many or like big dad, big daddy. I mean, this is Abraham, and he has to get there, right? Through this son, through this journey as he responds to God's call in his life. So we're back in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1. The Lord steps into the story. The Lord steps into the place where Abraham and his family had settled, some halfway from where God was hoping to take them, with these words: leave your country, Abram, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. So Abraham left. Abraham's life becomes kind of larger than sort of what we could think of as a single story. Because in so many ways, I mean, God does this, right? I mean, we know that sort of the three major religions in all the world attribute Abraham as kind of their father. So if you grew up in a Jewish household or a Muslim household or a Christian household, everybody was raising their hands, a father Abraham. Because this is sort of a place we trace back to the story. And God did this incredible thing. And yet the way the story's written, you and I are invited to see our own stories as moments in God's history where he steps in with his call and decides in you to write a new chapter of redemption on this earth. And so we go from this sense of hopelessness to responding to God's call. Tim Keller, in writing about this, sort of like, how do we see our own story in this? He says, what we realize about Abraham in these stories is that life didn't just happen to him. He happened to life. He responded to God's call, which leads us to that oh so important question: what do you do? What do I do when God's call comes? How do I respond? Well, I want to walk us through a number of things that are true, and we see them in this story in particular, and lots of places throughout God's story about God's call. The first one is this: God's call is essential. Abraham was raised in sort of the spiritual family that we read about in the ancient stories. He, by all intents and purposes, grew up in the church with the family. And yet he ended up, like all of us do, only halfway into what God has for us at best, until the call of God finds us. It's essential. It's the thing that moves us. I grew up in an amazing family. I mentioned my dad earlier. When I tell my story of how I was sort of raised, I'll say things like, I was incredibly loved by my mom and dad. And I even think they actually liked me. That was just the house I grew up in. It was just like they loved us and they poured it out, and it was all kinds of grace and all kinds of goodness. And then I grew up in an amazing church. This one. I kind of love our church, and I loved my experience of growing up here. And the Rachel Tidwells of my day poured into my life and into my relationships, and it was just rich and fun. And then the Jason Riveras of my era just poured into me, and I loved camp, and I loved being a part of youth ministry, and there was a lot of kind of the moral stuff in my home, and yet we were happy. And so when I look back, I think, had I just kind of gone through that experience, I probably would have liked the church. I probably would have loved being a part of a family. I probably would have had some sort of moral code. I might have been nice. My parents are generally. But at the end of the day, if the call of God doesn't come in and shake my life up, what Moses' story reminds us of is like, it doesn't matter. Because the essential ingredient to a life that matters, that shows up as a co-author with what God is doing, is, has it been reset? Has it been forgiven? Has it experienced the hope of God? Has it been to this place of humility and shock and awe and, oh, it's not my story. It doesn't matter how kind of good our family is. This is a call that's essential to every one of us. Now, the flip side of the coin of grace is equally beautiful, because it doesn't matter how bad I am. I mean, we look at Abraham's story. Sometimes we skip over this stuff. We do this with biblical characters. We do it with our own lives too. It's just not generally the lives of people around us, right? I don't know about you, but I'm a great husband, and I could tell you lots of things about my spouse that I'm like, well, we're working on that. And that's just how we see the world, right? All of us would rate ourselves as, in the upper 50 to 60 to 70% of nice people and smart people. And then I don't know how you actually do that math. And yet God's call comes, and it shows up in the midst of this, not because Abraham is a good guy. In fact, you might say it like this, that we aren't qualified so that we receive God's call. It's God's call in our lives that actually qualifies us. It invites us in to God's story. The story right after this one, and we're not going to dive into it, but God steps in, he gives this call, this beautiful, here's what I'm going to do through you, Abraham. We got this. Is the story of Abraham's response, his I will leave, as they walk through the nation of Egypt. What happens in the nation of Egypt is Abraham looks at his beautiful wife, Sarah, and he says, I know these people, so we need a plan. You're beautiful. They're going to try and steal you. In fact, then they may look at you and think, we're not going to steal, we're going to kill him and take her. And so Abraham leans into his wife. I frankly think this is the real reason she's barren, and says, hey, why don't we act like you're my sister? And that way I'm in the good, says Abraham. Again, it's just a bold reminder that God's call comes not because we pre-qualify ourselves, but because God loves us and he finds us in the middle of our mess, and oftentimes in the darkness of our hopelessness. And so his call is essential. His call is also personal. If we look at the text when God steps into Abraham's story and he says, let me just look at it. In verse 1, he says, leave your country. There's a collision here of two Hebrew words in the original language. And it's like this: go get yourself out. It's not just get out. It's not just leave. Go yourself out. In fact, if you look at it in the King James, which is a fun translation here, it says, get thee out. God's call comes to us. It doesn't come to our families. It doesn't come to our church. It meets you and me right where I am. Do you remember the story of the Apostle Peter? And it's a story at the very end of his life. I think it's in John chapter 21. And Peter's done the denying thing, and the rooster crows, and Jesus comes back and resurrects, and now it's all versions of confusion. Peter and Jesus meet on the beach. And it's this whole scene between Jesus and Peter. And Jesus, do you love me? Do you love me? Yes, I love you. And he says, well, then I want you to serve. I want you to give your life, Peter. And Jesus is like, and part of giving your life is going to look like this. And Peter's like, yeah, I'm not sure I'm in that, but I'll do it. And then he looks back at John and he's like, what about that guy? If I'm going to have to suffer, I just really would love to know he's going to have to suffer too. And Jesus looks at him like he looks at us, I think. He says, this calls personal, Peter. This calls personal, Nate. I want you. Don't worry about, I have plans for them. But I want you. It's your story that I'm grafting into my greater story. And if you're going to write it well, it will come by way of a personal call. So let's ask ourselves, have we encountered this God ourselves? Have we heard him call our name? Have we sought him in the dark or the light of our own lives? We know we have when this next point kind of rolls off our tongue, because the call of God is always volitional. And what I mean by that is it's always a collision between my will and God's will. And somebody that would say, oh yeah, I walk with God, and there's never a collision between your will and his, I'm sitting there going, yeah, I don't know. You may be walking with some version of God that you have in your mind and maybe even your heart. But when God's call comes, it's a complete surrender of our will. Look at the text with me. What does he say? He says, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go. This is incredible, right? Abraham's like, yeah, we're going to go together. We're going to get this done. God's on our side. To the land where? That I will show you. Give up everything. Come with me to some place I'm not going to tell you about. Let's go. If you've lived a Christian life, like if we're honest, there's a part of that we hate. It's terrible. If we're honest, God says, come on, let's go. Give up everything. Okay, God, where are we going? I'll show you later. No, I'd really like to know now before I actually give up everything. I'm kind of content with everything. Haran's not all that bad, God. Can you just tell me where I'm? Some of you got, and I think I have one here. Some of you got a little compass. We ran out this morning. Sorry about that. But wouldn't it be great? I think most of us sort of orientate ourselves to God and his will with a sense of like, wouldn't it be great if we could pull out our iPhone, pull up like Google Maps or whatever our map thing is, and go, okay, God, I'm willing to follow, but I'd really like to see where we're going. And so let me just type in here, God's will for Nate today. And God would say, okay, well, wake on up, have this for breakfast because it's going to be the healthiest choice. You know, say this to your kids before you leave. 200 feet out the door, turn left, then turn right, then do this. Hey, could you go interrupt them? They're really struggling. Hey, could you go do this? They need to talk. Hey, here's when you should go get some exercise. Because if you don't, that whole story of your story, the bookends are going to shrink. So take care of yourself, whatever. But that isn't how God comes. That is not what the call of God looks like. It looks much more like God handing us a compass and saying, Nate, I want you to orient your life around a few things. I want you to know that I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm the God who went to the cross, climbed out of the grave on your behalf. I want you to orient your life to that truth. And then I want you to trust me. I want you to just go. Step into my call for your life. Where are we going, God? When are we going to get there? What's it really going to cost? I'll show you. Orientate yourself and walk with me and trust me. You know, I don't know about you, but oftentimes like, yeah, I would go if. God, I'll give if, as long as I know there's going to be enough to get my kid through that call, like, okay, then I'll give. I'll be generous even. You know, God, I'll serve. I'll serve as long as it doesn't like cost me a Sunday afternoon with a bunch of breakout kids when like the greatest football game in Detroit Lions history is on, right? Or whatever. And we get to these points and we're like, God, I'll give, but I just want to know, what's it going to cost? You know, in the life of Abraham, it went a little bit like this. Abraham, get out. Get thee out. Where are we going? I'll show you. Abraham, I'm going to give you a son. In fact, I'm not just going to give you a son. I'm going to give you descendants that like fill the sky like the stars. Like, how are you going to do that? I'll show you. Trust me. Abraham, I want you to take your son and I want you to go up that mountain and I want you to sacrifice him. Why? Why would you ask me? Like, I'll show you later. Trust me. Orientate yourself to my goodness, to who I am. Step into the call, and we'll walk this out together. I'll show you later. And there'll always be a collision of our will, of saying, I think I maybe know better. I think I maybe got this one. And this is where we hear clearly God's call in our lives. It was sort of brought home to me as I had a privilege to sit with this family that I did the service for on Wednesday, and amazing older couple. I just love them, Duncan and Edith McKenzie. And sort of we were just talking about life and crying some tears and remembering life. And I said, you did 73 years of marriage. You guys loved each other. You like what if you were to reflect back, like, how did you do it? And she said some words that I wrote down. Here's what she said. She said, we made a simple habit of doing what God asked. And then she looked at me and she started crying. And she said, we had a good life. We had everything we could have ever. We made a simple habit of doing what God asked. Simple does not mean easy. Simple does not mean risky, that it's not risky. Doesn't mean it'll cost you far more than you think you have. But it's clear. It says, when I discern the will of God for me, I'm stepping in. I'm stepping in. It's volitional. And then these last two we'll get through fairly quickly. And we see in the story that God's calls missional, right? God comes to Abraham and he says what? He says, I'm going to bless you. To which Abraham's like, woo! I mean, all of us, right? It's like, hey, you won. I'm on your side. Everyone's like, yeah. And then he's like, and guess what? I'm going to also change everything that's going on inside of you from being a person that wants to receive blessing to a person that gives blessing. And if there's one thing we see in the story arc of the story of God, it's this, that if you live your life, if I live my life seeking to receive others' blessing, I will end this life empty. But if I live this life seeking to be a blessing, I will leave this life full. Happens every time. And so what we see is this incredible piece of mission change where I begin to ask myself, how can I be a blessing with that which God has given me? What does that look like? Well, it gets worked out in our environments, in our culture, or from this cultural perspective, as we seek to be the kind of people that leave, and yet we don't actually ever arrive. Look at the story of Abraham, right? He gets this incredible promise. Some of you respond to a promise like this, like at church camp, and you're like, I'm all in with God. Because he has a future, a hope, a heaven. And you start with this promise, and he's like, hey, I'll show you later. And then you walk around in circles for like a long time. And at some point in the journey, you think to yourself, you know what? I'm not sure we're ever going to get there. And that's part of the tension of living our stories in the midst of God's. We aren't going to get there. We will live between the promise and the fulfillment of that. That's our place in the story. For Abraham, that looked like, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, he got to hold his child, but he didn't see what God was going to do. And so somewhere in this tension, we walk out what it looks like to live our lives as a part of what it looks like to respond to God's call. I love the words of theologian Miroslav Volf, and maybe you've heard me quote him before. And here's what he says, and I think there's some clarity in this that's helpful as we seek to walk this out. He says this. He says, the courage to break his, and this is Abraham's, cultural and familial ties and abandon the gods of his ancestors out of allegiance to a God of all families and all culture was the original Abrahamic revolution. He says this, he says, Christians can never be first of all Asians or Americans or Croatians or Russians or Tutsis and then Christians. He says at the very core, this is the revolution. This is what it looks like to respond to the call of God in our lives. That the core of us gets changed, he says. At the core of Christian identity lies an all-encompassing change of loyalty from a given culture with its gods to the God of all cultures. A response to a call from that God entails rearrangement of a whole network of allegiances. Departure is part and parcel of Christian identity. What is God asking me to leave? Departure, he goes on to say, is no longer a spatial category. It's not like I have to leave or go anywhere physically necessarily. It can take place within the cultural space that one inhabits. The proper distance, he says, from a culture does not take Christians out of that culture. Rather, when they've responded to the call of the gospel, they've stepped, as it were, with one foot outside their own culture, while with their other remaining firmly planted in it. They are distant, and yet they belong. We think of Jesus' words when he says, "You are the salt of the earth." You know, it would have been easier at one level, in Abraham's story as well as ours, just to stay put. You know, they call it a comfort zone for a reason, right? It would have been fine. Just stay there. It's fine. Things are okay. It would have been easier in Abraham's situation to leave and then to arrive. Like, yeah, we got it. Let's build high walls. Let's all speak the same language and look the same. But somewhere in the middle is a place where God's doing his work in us and his best work through us. When we leave our culture and its gods, and we become a kind of people who are allegiant to the God of all cultures. This is what it looks like to step in, to be salt in our world, to have our allegiance with him, but not to be completely pulled away. So how do we get into this? How do we hear God's call? How do we, is that the serpent? Is that him? How do I actually hear it? And our story, again, is a lot like Abraham's. For Abraham, there was one promise that the rest of the promises all hinged on. You know, God comes to Abraham and says, "I'm going to make you a nation." And Abraham's like, "Well, I need a son." He said, "I'm going to make that nation, it's going to be amazing. It's going to bless the world." And Abraham's like, "Still need a son." And the story unwinds in such a way is to remind us to keep our eyes on the Son of grace. It's a story that points us to God's Son, to what God's Son would ultimately do by giving up his life, that we would hear in the forgiveness he offers as clearly as he can shout it in our direction, our call. Now, there's a section in the New Testament which really, I think, kind of brings us to this similar kind of place where Abraham is in his story. And if we had time, we could read John chapter 14 and 15, and we'd see all kinds of overlap. I want to just point us to a couple. And what's happening in John chapter 14 is John tells his disciples, "Hey guys, I'm leaving. I'm heading back to my place in heaven. You guys got this. Grab your pen, write your chapter. We're going to do this together." And he's about ready to give his life for them, to come back from the grave, to send the Spirit of God to direct them in their journey. And they do what we would do. Wait a second. We're just starting to figure this out. What in the world's going to happen? And here's what we read in John chapter 14. Jesus says this. He says, "Don't let your heart be troubled. You guys believe in God. Believe also in me." And then he says this, as if to almost kind of bait, I think, at least Thomas. "You know the way to where I'm going." You guys already know the way. And what does Thomas respond with? "Jesus, we have no idea what you're talking about right now. Thank you very much. We don't know the way. We don't know where you're going. We're kind of lost. Spell it out for us, Jesus. Throw us a line. Where are you going? How are we going to get there? Why are we..." On and on and on. And what does Jesus then say in these infamous words? Jesus answered, "I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. No one comes to the Father. You know the way. Lean in. Walk with me. Trust me. Leave that culture. Walk with me. Trust that I'm good. You're not going to have all the answers. I'll show you when we get there, but we're going to walk it out together. You know the way. Jesus says, I am the way. And he points us to say, our call comes by way of an invitation of the Son of Man himself, that we could know and find our place in his story as his children.
Thanks so much for joining us, church. We hope that you enjoyed this message. If you'd like to hear more messages like this, or if you'd like to partner with us financially, please visit sierrabible.com.